Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The air was frozen and heavy with diesel fumes. German engines coughed through the cold as armored columns pushed west, their treads crushing snow into mud and ice. Fuel gauges trembled near empty. Every drop of gasoline was life, and every delay brought death closer. Then, on a narrow Belgian road near Stavelot, a patrol stumbled upon an abandoned American supply dump. Inside stood rows of steel drums, 50,000 gallons of precious U.S. fuel. For a moment, silence fell across the frozen clearing. Men stared in disbelief. They had found what their army had been dying without. A colonel ordered the barrels checked. Some cheered, others prayed. Engines roared back to life, tanks fueled to the brim. But when his men asked where they would go next, the colonel gave no answer. He knew what they didn't. 50,000 gallons was a gift and a curse, because the discovery that day didn't prove hope. It proved the truth Germany had tried to deny all year. Even with the enemy's fuel in their hands, they no longer had a war they could win. By the winter of 1944, Germany's war machine was running on fumes, literally. What had begun 5 years earlier as a lightning-fast conquest had become a desperate struggle for survival. On every front, from the crumbling ruins of the Eastern Front to the skies over the Reich, fuel had become the one resource that mattered. More than men or guns, every tank that roared into battle in the first years of the war had depended on an endless river of oil flowing from occupied territories and synthetic fuel plants. By late 1944, those rivers had dried up. Allied bombing campaigns had shattered refineries, railways, and pipelines. Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, once the lifeline of the Wehrmacht, were smoking ruins. Each new offensive required fuel that no longer existed. Hitler's generals warned him that the Reich could not sustain another large-scale attack. But Hitler refused to listen. He believed that one last strike in the West could change everything, a counterblow that would divide the Allies, seize their fuel, and force a negotiated peace. That plan became Operation Herbstnebel, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. In mid-December 1944, under thick fog and snow, German forces launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the same forest they had used to invade France in 1940. It was an echo of past triumphs, but the army that moved through the trees now was not the same. Its tanks were powerful, its soldiers still disciplined, but the one thing it lacked was what modern war required most: fuel. The attack depended on speed and deception. Panzer columns under Sepp Dietrich and Jochen Peiper of the SS were ordered to capture Allied fuel depots along the way. Their entire advance was planned around gasoline, not geography. Every mile they gained had to be paid for with fuel scavenged from enemy reserves. The irony was brutal. The Wehrmacht, once the master of movement, was now reduced to fighting a war of theft, a race to steal enough American gasoline to keep moving. Peiper's armored spearhead, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, cut deep into Belgium, smashing through Allied lines and seizing towns at lightning speed. But behind the spectacle of advance was chaos. Fuel trucks ran dry, engines sputtered and died. Tanks were abandoned by the roadside when their last drops were gone. By December 19th, Peiper's column had captured several American supply depots, including one near Stavelot, containing tens of thousands of gallons of fuel. To his men, it felt like salvation. To their commanders, it was a cruel illusion. Even with the captured fuel, they couldn't deliver it where it was needed. The German supply network was collapsing. Bridges were gone, roads frozen, and Allied air power, grounded for days by fog, was waiting for the skies to clear. Every drum of captured fuel had to be transported by hand or commandeered truck, and the frontline tanks still lay miles ahead. When the first barrels were opened, engineers found that much of the gasoline had been contaminated by ice or grit. Some had been deliberately sabotaged by retreating Americans. Others had been marked for aircraft and burned too hot for German engines. A few Panthers burst into flames before even leaving the depot. Still, Peiper pressed forward. His tanks rolled east of Stavelot toward the Meuse River, trying to reach the bridges that would carry them deeper into Allied territory. But every mile drained their reserves. Soon they were stealing fuel not only from captured American stockpiles, but from their own disabled vehicles. By the third week of December, the once proud spearhead was surrounded. Peiper's men destroyed their tanks and fled on foot through the snow, The offensive that Hitler had promised would split the Allies instead split his own army apart. More than 500 German vehicles were abandoned, not from combat losses, but from an empty fuel gauge. To Allied commanders, the situation revealed the truth they had suspected all along. The German army's last great gamble wasn't powered by courage or strategy. It was powered by desperation. And to the German officers who led it, that desperation was now unmistakable. One colonel, overseeing a depot of captured American fuel near Stavelot, stared at the rows of barrels shimmering in the pale winter light. He ordered his men to guard them carefully as if the fuel itself were sacred. But as the sounds of artillery drew closer, he understood what the barrels really represented. They weren't salvation. They were proof. Proof that the only way Germany could keep fighting was by using the enemy's strength against him, and that even then, it would never be enough. By late December 1944, the snow in the Ardennes was stained black with oil and ash. Burned-out vehicles lay like carcasses along the frozen roads. German Panthers, American Shermans, half-tracks, and fuel trucks all twisted together in the same graveyard of iron. The battle that Hitler had called his last great gamble had already begun to unravel, not because of courage or leadership, but because of simple mathematics. Germany had launched the Ardennes offensive with less than 2 weeks of fuel for its armored divisions. In theory, that was enough to reach the Meuse River and seize Allied depots before the reserves ran out. In practice, it was suicide. Every hour of driving consumed thousands of gallons that no depot, captured or not, could replace. The plan depended on surprise, on fog, and on luck. The fog came, the surprise worked, but luck ran out almost immediately. Allied units fought harder than expected, and the terrain was worse than maps suggested. German convoys crawled through single-lane forest roads where wrecked vehicles blocked entire columns. One disabled tank could stall an entire division. Meanwhile, every German commander in the field knew the unspoken truth. They weren't attacking to win a war, but to delay a defeat. The offensive had been designed to capture Allied supplies because Germany had none of its own left to move. The Reich's fuel production had collapsed under relentless Allied bombing. Synthetic plants at Leuna, Merseburg, and Bulge lay in ruins. Coal trains no longer reached the refineries. Airfields stood empty. By December, the Luftwaffe could barely operate. Its once feared fighter wings were grounded not by enemy pilots but by dry fuel tanks. To feed the Ardennes gamble, the High Command stripped every remaining drop of gasoline from training units, supply depots, even hospitals. Truck convoys were cannibalized to fill tankers for the panzers. There was nothing left to fall back on if the offensive failed, and failure, though unspoken, was already in motion. When German troops captured the American fuel near Stavelot, they rejoiced. At least briefly. The barrels represented not just gasoline but hope. But logistics is not built on hope. Within hours, the colonel in charge realized what others already feared. There was no way to move it forward. Allied artillery made the roads impassable. Bridges were collapsing. And every truck still running was already overloaded with wounded men or ammunition. In the villages nearby, German soldiers who had once marched proudly now begged civilians for fuel, food, or shelter. They siphoned gasoline from abandoned cars, even drained aircraft fuel from crashed planes. Some units resorted to pulling light artillery with horses. It was 1944, but the German army was fighting like it was 1918 again. The American response came quickly. Once the weather cleared, Allied air superiority returned in full force. Fighter bombers roamed the skies, turning every German vehicle into a target. Supply convoys that had barely begun to move were shredded on the roads. The barrels captured at Stavelot became worthless. No one could risk moving them. Piper's once proud column spearheading the offensive was now stranded. He radioed headquarters asking for fuel and reinforcements. The reply came hours later. None available. Hold your position. It was the final confirmation that Germany's last offensive had already failed. By Christmas Eve, Piper abandoned his tanks. He ordered the engines destroyed, the remaining fuel burned, and his men to withdraw on foot through the snow. Of the 5,000 men who had begun the assault, fewer than half made it back. For the colonel who had guarded the captured American fuel, the irony was complete. The fuel was still there, untouched, glimmering in the snow, but it might as well have been on the moon. It could no longer save them. That night, as artillery flashes lit the forest, he stood beside the barrels and realized the war's ending had already been written. The fuel symbolized everything Germany had once believed about itself: mechanical perfection, precision, speed, power. Now it represented something else entirely: dependence, exhaustion. In defeat. He ordered his men to destroy the depot before retreating. The explosions that followed sent towers of flame into the frozen air, fire that briefly illuminated the forest, then faded into smoke and silence. It was December 25, 1944, Christmas in the Ardennes, and as the flames died, so did Germany's last illusion of victory. The story of that captured fuel depot isn't just about a single moment in the Ardennes. It is a reflection of the war itself, a war that had become less about fighting and more about feeding the fight. Every shell, every mile, every tank engine was powered not by courage or ideology, but by oil. And in 1944, oil had chosen its side. For Germany, this was the cruelest revelation. Its armies were still disciplined, its weapons still formidable, but the lifeblood of modern war was gone. What the colonel saw in those American barrels was more than gasoline. It was the visible proof that the United States had built an empire of supply, a machine so vast that even what it lost in retreat dwarfed what Germany could ever produce. To the men of the Wehrmacht, the difference was staggering. A single American division consumed more fuel in one day than some entire German corps received in a week. The U.S. Army's logistical capacity was so immense that losing 50,000 gallons barely registered on a daily report. For the Germans who captured it, that amount could have sustained an entire armored regiment, if they'd had the means to move it. That contrast defined the modern age of warfare. Germany had fought the war it wanted to fight, one of movement, shock, and tactical brilliance. America fought the war it could fight, one of production, endurance, and relentless replacement. And in the long run, the war of factories always defeats the war of flair. From the tactical angle, the German plan for the Ardennes offensive was fatally ambitious. Hitler's obsession with recreating the triumph of 1940 blinded him to how the world had changed. He believed that surprise and aggression could overcome logistics, that determination could replace fuel. His generals, Model, Manteuffel, Dietrich, all knew otherwise, but they lacked the power to contradict him. They followed orders even when the numbers didn't add up. In that sense, the capture of the American fuel was a cruel echo of Hitler's delusion. The barrels represented a temporary reprieve, a symbolic victory that only deepened the tragedy. It proved the German army could still win small battles, but never the war. The human angle was even more haunting. The soldiers who guarded the depot were young, cold, and starving. Many were barely out of training. They had been told they were fighting for the survival of their nation, yet what they saw around them looked like collapse. Their commanders spoke of honor and destiny, but what filled their days were empty stomachs, frozen nights, and engines that wouldn't start. Letters later found on German soldiers from that winter reveal a mix of confusion and disbelief. One wrote, "We have captured American gasoline, but no one knows how to bring it forward. It is strange to see what we need so close, yet so far away." Another described watching U.S. aircraft return to the skies once the weather cleared. "They move as if they never tire. We hide, they burn our trucks. They have everything." These weren't the words of arrogance or hatred anymore. They were the words of men who had realized they were fighting a nation that simply couldn't be stopped. From the technological angle, the gap was insurmountable. American logistics had evolved into a living organism, a global network of oil tankers, pipelines, and convoys that stretched from Texas to the Thames. The same system that fed Patton's tanks in France also fueled bombers over Berlin and ships in the Pacific. It was a supply chain so vast that even the loss of a depot or a fleet barely rippled its surface. Germany had no such system left. Its railroads were bombed. Its fuel plants were destroyed. Its trucks were outnumbered and worn beyond repair. Every barrel of fuel meant for the front required weeks of desperate coordination and sacrifice. And still, it never arrived in time. The moral angle of the story lies in its irony. For years, German propaganda had mocked American soldiers as soft, materialistic, dependent on machines. But those same machines, trucks, tankers, assembly lines, had given the Allies their greatest weapon: endurance. It was not about fighting harder. It was about never running out. That's what the colonel realized when he looked at the captured fuel. He wasn't looking at a trophy of victory. He was looking at the proof of defeat, the physical symbol of how completely Germany had lost the war of production long before it lost the war of battle. He had fought bravely, commanded well, and believed deeply. But no amount of skill could overcome arithmetic. In that frozen Belgian clearing, surrounded by barrels that could not be used, he saw the truth that his leaders refused to speak aloud. Germany was no longer a superpower. It was a starving giant, running on the fumes of past glory, trapped in a war it could no longer afford to fight. For the Americans on the other side of the front, the Battle of the Bulge was chaos. Convoys were scattered, weather-grounded aircraft and radio lines went silent. Fuel depots like the one near Stavelo were abandoned not out of panic but necessity. Units pulled back to regroup, unaware that the gasoline they left behind would soon become a symbol of the war's final reckoning. When word reached Allied command that German troops had captured American fuel, the reaction wasn't fear and it was disbelief. To most U.S. officers, the idea of the enemy running his tanks on American gasoline felt absurd, even comical. But as intelligence reports confirmed the theft, concern shifted to something deeper. If the Germans were that desperate, it meant the offensive was unsustainable. At Chef headquarters, Eisenhower's staff analyzed intercepted radio traffic that mentioned fuel shortages, vehicles stranded, and tanks destroyed for lack of supply. The conclusion was immediate and unanimous: the German army was burning itself out. The only question was how much damage it could do before running dry. That understanding shaped every Allied decision that followed. Rather than rushing blindly to counterattack, Eisenhower let the weather and logistics fight the Germans for him. He knew that once the skies cleared, air power would finish what fuel starvation had begun. It was a cold, methodical strategy, one built on patience and confidence in a supply system that could wait, because it never stopped moving. That patience was rewarded. By the last week of December, the weather broke. The clouds that had hidden German movements lifted, and the full might of Allied air power returned to the sky. Columns that had advanced confidently days before were now sitting ducks. Fuel trucks burst into flames. Roadblocks turned into infernos, and even the barrels of captured American gasoline, once guarded as treasure, became bombs waiting to explode. The German colonel's realization was now shared by many others. Across the front, officers radioed reports of stalled divisions, of men marching through snow without food or fuel, of entire regiments stranded and destroyed without ever firing a shot. One Wehrmacht report described it simply: "Our tanks are powerful. Our men are brave. Our enemy is logistics." On the ground, the difference between the two armies was stark. American supply convoys, thousands of trucks organized in the Red Ball Express only months earlier, still rumbled across France, hauling everything from ammunition to chocolate bars. German supply lines, by contrast, were a patchwork of horse carts, captured vehicles, and exhausted drivers working without rest. For every American gallon burned, 10 more were ready to replace it. For every German tank fueled, another 5 stood idle, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The technological imbalance reached absurd levels. In late 1944, the United States was producing 8 times more fuel per month than Germany. Even with Allied losses, the surplus was overwhelming. Factories in Louisiana, Texas, and Pennsylvania churned out aviation gasoline faster than the Wehrmacht could consume it. Tankers crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys, refueling the war like a machine feeding itself. It wasn't just industry, it was momentum. That was something the German High Command could neither match nor comprehend. They had built their strategy on speed, believing war could be won through quick victories and superior tactics. But industrial war doesn't reward brilliance, and it rewards endurance. It punishes those who cannot replace what they lose. By 1944, America could replace a tank faster than Germany could repair one, and could fill a fuel depot faster than the Wehrmacht could move its reserves. From a psychological angle, this realization crushed even the most loyal officers. The colonel guarding the captured fuel was not alone in his despair. Across Germany, officers were writing letters filled with quiet resignation. They saw that their soldiers still fought bravely, but bravery could not refuel tanks or restart engines. They knew that every battle won tactically was already lost strategically. For the Americans, the emotional impact was different. a mix of confidence and disbelief. They had been on the defensive, suffering heavy losses, yet their supply lines kept functioning. Trucks still arrived. Fuel still flowed. Even in retreat, America's logistical machine kept rolling forward. And when the time came to strike back, it did so with a power that seemed limitless. By January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed completely. What had begun as a daring strike ended as a retreat through snow and fire. Tanks once meant to spearhead victory now lay abandoned, their tracks frozen. Frozen solid, the colonel who had guarded the American fuel depot was captured days later, wandering among the wrecks. When questioned by Allied officers, he didn't speak of strategy or orders. He spoke only of fuel. According to one U.S. intelligence report, he said quietly, "You do not fight armies anymore. You fight machines that never stop. We were finished before we began." That single sentence carried the weight of truth, not bitterness, not excuse, just recognition. In that winter forest, surrounded by the wreckage of his own country's ambition, the colonel had seen the future. He had seen a world where industrial power, not ideology, decided the fate of nations, and he understood that Germany's defeat had been sealed not in battle, but in the factories and oil fields it never controlled. The final days of the German offensive were a study in exhaustion. Engines coughed themselves silent in the snow. Tanks stood like statues, their steel frozen by the cold and their crews huddled inside for warmth. For miles, the roads of the Ardennes were choked with machines that had once symbolized power but now stood powerless, reminders that motion itself had become the rarest commodity of war. When the skies cleared at the end of December, the Allies struck with precision and fury. Fighter bombers roared overhead, shredding convoys, fuel trucks, and bridges. The same American gasoline that the Germans had captured now turned against them, igniting in spectacular fireballs that lit the forest like brief suns. Each explosion marked not just the loss of a vehicle, but the collapse of an illusion. The Blitzkrieg, once the pride of the Reich, was now a slow burn in the snow. On the ground, discipline gave way to chaos. Orders became meaningless. Whole units dissolved as soldiers tried to escape the tightening Allied counteroffensive. Piper's SS troops, once hailed as the spearhead of the operation, now fought only to survive. Their fuel was gone, their ammunition nearly exhausted, and their comrades lost in the blizzard. When Allied forces surrounded them near La Gleize, Piper ordered the last tanks destroyed and led his men on foot through the woods, abandoning the very machines that had once defined them. It was the same everywhere. Columns stalled. Trucks sat empty. Commanders stared at maps that no longer mattered. Every line of advance, every bridge, every depot that had been the dream of Hitler's last victory turned to smoke and wreckage. At headquarters in Berlin, reports from the front arrived like funeral notices. Each confirmed what the colonel in Stavelot had already seen with his own eyes. The war had entered its final stage. There would be no more grand offensives, no more breakthroughs. Germany's army could still fight, but it could no longer move. In military history, movement is life. An army that cannot move, cannot attack, cannot retreat, cannot even surrender on its own terms. It becomes a monument to itself, a machine still running in theory, but dead in every practical sense. That was the Wehrmacht in early 1945, a structure of iron and pride without the oil to make it breathe. Meanwhile, the Allies moved with mechanical inevitability. Patton's Third Army, once slowed by weather, now advanced like a storm. Fuel convoys rolled behind his tanks in endless lines, an industrial artery pulsing across France and into Belgium. Each truck carried more fuel than an entire German company could dream of, and there were thousands of them. The same American logistics that had once seemed excessive now looked like genius. The Red Ball Express, reactivated and expanded, made sure no tank ran dry, no advance paused. To the Germans, this was terrifying. They had always believed that courage could balance numbers, that skill could offset production. But now, even the bravest men felt the weight of arithmetic pressing down. They saw an enemy that could lose 100 tanks and replace them within days. They saw skies filled with aircraft that never seemed to run out of fuel. They saw convoys that reached beyond the horizon. Proof that for America, war was an act of endless motion. In the field, the colonel and his men watched the Allied counterattack close in. They fought briefly, not for victory but for survival. Each burst of gunfire seemed smaller, each explosion more distant. They burned what remained of the captured fuel, rather than let it fall back into American hands. Black smoke rose into the cold air, the last visible trace of their effort. When the fighting ended, silence returned to the forest. Snow began to fall again, covering the wreckage. Trucks, helmets, shell casings, the scorched ground where the fuel depot had once stood. It was as if the war itself wanted to bury its own mistakes. The colonel was taken prisoner days later near Malmedy. He was exhausted, his uniform torn, his boots caked in ice. When questioned by his American captors, he showed no anger, no defiance. He spoke quietly, almost respectfully. One officer later recalled his words. "We thought fuel could save us, but fuel is only power when it moves. Yours always moved. Ours stopped." That single statement captured the essence of Germany's defeat. It was not just about strength or courage or leadership. It was about movement, the invisible pulse that keeps an army alive. And when that pulse stopped, even the mightiest army in Europe became still. The Battle of the Bulge, meant to break the Allies, had instead broken Germany. It revealed that the Reich's once feared military machine was a shell, loud, deadly, but hollow. The colonel's captured fuel depot was its symbol, a mountain of energy that could not be used. A final gift from a dying army to history itself. For the men who lived through it, that winter would never be forgotten. It was the season when engines froze, when fire died, and when an empire finally understood that no belief, no strategy, no will could survive without supply. When the snow finally stopped falling, the battlefield looked less like victory or defeat and more like a graveyard of machines. Tanks frozen mid-turn, trucks half buried in drifts, artillery left where it jammed. The Ardennes had become a museum of halted motion. Steel monuments to a war that had consumed everything and could no longer sustain itself. American patrols moved carefully through the wreckage, counting the price of the last German gamble. They found burned tanks still warm from internal fires, shattered fuel drums, rifles scattered across ice. Some units reported strange sights. Barrels of clean American gasoline lying untouched beside German tanks that had run dry just meters away. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The enemy had captured fuel that could have saved them, and yet they had perished within sight of it. As engineers cleared the roads, U.S. officers began documenting the scale of the German failure. The reports read like postmortems. Entire armored regiments immobilized not by firepower, but by fuel shortages. Commanders forced to abandon equipment worth millions. Thousands of soldiers left to freeze or surrender because they simply could not move. In one such report, an American captain wrote, "The enemy was not defeated by us. He was defeated by arithmetic." It was a truth both brutal and elegant. War had finally become industrial mathematics, a matter of inputs and outputs of what could be replaced and what could not. Germany's army, built on daring and precision, had reached the end of that equation. By January 1945, the once feared Wehrmacht was collapsing everywhere. The Battle of the Bulge, which Hitler had envisioned as a turning point, had instead drained his last reserves. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Over 600 tanks and armored vehicles were lost, and with them went the last usable stockpiles of fuel. In Berlin, the reaction was disbelief. Hitler refused to accept that the offensive had failed. He ordered new plans drawn up, demanded fresh fuel allocations, and blamed his generals for cowardice. But there was no fuel to allocate. Every barrel that could be found was already committed to the Eastern Front, where the Red Army was preparing its final push. Even the Luftwaffe's once proud fighter squadrons could barely launch a handful of sorties each day. The Reich's war machine had been reduced to a collection of ideas, none of them capable of moving an engine. For the Allies, the collapse came faster than expected. Once the Ardennes was cleared, the counterattack rolled east with unstoppable force. The same logistical network that had sustained them through the worst winter of the war now became their weapon. Patton's and Montgomery's forces converged, pushing across the Rhine by March. Each advance was fueled by an ocean of American supply: gasoline, food, spare parts, replacement tanks, all flowing in an unbroken line from the ports of Normandy to the front. The contrast to the German retreat could not have been sharper. Where the Americans moved forward with rhythmic precision, the Germans fell back in fragments. Their tanks were destroyed not only by enemy fire, but by their own crews who blew them up to prevent capture. In some cases, officers ordered vehicles burned simply because there was no fuel to move them. The smoke rising from these self-made pyres marked the slow, bitter end of the army that had once defined speed. When Allied intelligence officers later interviewed captured German staff officers, one theme repeated itself again and again. They all spoke of fuel or rather the absence of it. One Luftwaffe logistics officer confessed, "We lost the war when we lost Ploiești. After that, every plan was a dream." Another from the Panzer Corps admitted, "We could still build tanks, but they were only statues. Without fuel, they were monuments to defeat." The colonel captured near Stavelot was among those interrogated. When shown photographs of his destroyed fuel depot, he reportedly said nothing for a long time. Then he whispered something the interpreter didn't immediately catch. Later it was translated, "That was the day Germany died." He wasn't referring to the battle itself. He meant the realization, the moment he understood that no courage, no loyalty, no faith in Hitler's orders could overcome the basic truth that wars of the modern age were won not by brilliance, but by motion. And motion belonged to those who could sustain it. To the Americans who heard his words, it was sobering. They had fought men who, even in defeat, were disciplined and skilled. But they also recognized that they had been fighting an idea, the idea that sheer will could bend reality. The Battle of the Bulge proved otherwise. Reality was made of logistics, fuel, and factories. When U.S. forces finally reclaimed the burned depot at Stavelot, they found only scorched barrels and blackened snow. Engineers estimated that nearly 50,000 gallons had been destroyed or lost. But to the Americans, it didn't matter. Within a day, new convoys brought twice that amount to the front. That was the difference. For one side, 50,000 gallons was survival. For the other, it was a statistic. The war in Europe would last only a few more months. But the Battle of the Bulge had already answered the question of who would win. The answer wasn't written in strategy, but in the relentless hum of engines that never stopped. The German colonel's barrels of fuel became a metaphor for an empire that had burned itself out. Powerful, ambitious, but unsustainable. And as his men marched into captivity, the last light of the Reich flickered out in the reflection of burning oil. In the weeks after the Ardennes offensive collapsed, the Western Front changed character. The roar of engines that had once filled the forest fell silent. The roads that had echoed with treads and gunfire now carried only prisoners and wreckage. For the Allies, it was a time of regrouping. For the Germans, it was a time of reckoning. The official reports from the front read like obituaries for the Wehrmacht's mobility. The once proud panzer divisions, the cutting edge of German military power, were shadows of themselves. In less than 6 weeks, they had lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, 1,600 artillery pieces, and thousands of trucks that could never be replaced. Factories in the Reich were bombed to rubble. Fuel reserves, already almost gone, were annihilated. The Luftwaffe, which had been virtually absent during the offensive, ceased to exist as a fighting force. For the Allies, the scale of German losses confirmed what their intelligence officers had already known. The Third Reich had fired its last shot. It had gambled everything, its remaining oil, manpower, and morale, on one final offensive, and lost it all in the snow. Captured documents later revealed the desperation behind the decision. Hitler had been warned repeatedly that the offensive was impossible without guaranteed access to fuel. His generals, Rundstedt, Model, and even the fanatical Sepp Dietrich, had argued for a limited strike or a defensive stand. But Hitler refused. He saw the capture of American fuel depots as the key to victory. In his mind, the barrels waiting in Allied dumps were an untapped arsenal that could turn defeat into triumph. That delusion carried an empire into ruin. When those barrels burned in Stavelot, so did the last remnants of German strategy. The consequences went far beyond the battlefield. Every liter of fuel consumed in the Ardennes was one not available for the Eastern Front. By January 1945, as the Red Army crossed the Vistula and advanced toward Berlin, German tank units on the Eastern Front were immobilized. Whole divisions fought without armor, reduced to static defense lines. The Reich's generals blamed the Western offensive for the disaster, calling it a suicide mission that bled us dry. Inside Germany, the mood changed. For the first time, Even loyal citizens began to understand that the war could no longer be won. Trains stopped running regularly. Factories stood idle for lack of coal and oil. Cities were plunged into darkness as power grids failed. Every symbol of progress, the airplane, the tank, the motorized division, now stood as a reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, in the Allied camps, soldiers who had fought through the snow tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. They had faced an enemy who fought hard, who struck fast, and who refused to surrender until the last bullet. But when they reached the captured German vehicles, they realized the enemy hadn't been beaten by courage or numbers. He had been beaten by silence, the silence of engines that no longer ran. One American war correspondent described the scene at La Glaise. The tanks were beautiful, even in ruin, but they were empty, as if the war itself had run out of breath. That emptiness echoed across Europe in the final months of the war. The Allies advanced faster than ever before, not because resistance had vanished, but because Germany could no longer move to resist. Its armies retreated on foot, its trains halted, its trucks abandoned. The speed that had once defined blitzkrieg now belonged to the other side. For the colonel who had once guarded the captured American fuel, captivity brought reflection more than humiliation. According to interrogation notes preserved in U.S. archives, he admitted that even if his men had used every drop of that fuel, it would not have changed the outcome. He said quietly, "We could have reached the Meuse. We could have burned more towns, but it would only have delayed the end, not prevented it." It was a sober truth that many of his fellow officers would repeat in post-war interviews. The Battle of the Bulge had not been Germany's last chance at victory. It had been its final act of denial. After the guns fell silent, the Battle of the Bulge entered history not as a triumph of strategy, but as a monument to futility. The forest that had once echoed with the thunder of artillery became quiet again, its silence broken only by the wind and the sound of Allied recovery teams clearing wreckage from the roads. The war would continue for only a few more months, but the meaning of that winter was already written. The Ardennes had exposed the truth about the Third Reich's final phase, that it was running on empty, driven more by faith than by fuel. In the years that followed, historians and soldiers alike would look back on the captured fuel episode at Stavelot as a symbol of the wider war. For many Germans, it represented the final realization that technological brilliance and bravery could not overcome industrial imbalance. They had built the finest tanks, the most advanced aircraft, the most disciplined army, and yet none of it could function without the resources that their enemies commanded in abundance. The colonel captured near Stavelot was among those interrogated. When shown photographs of his destroyed fuel depot, he reportedly said nothing for a long time. Then he whispered something the interpreter didn't immediately catch. Later it was translated, "That was the day Germany died." He wasn't referring to the battle itself. He meant the realization, the moment he understood that no courage, no loyalty, no faith in Hitler's orders could overcome the basic truth that wars of the modern age were won not by brilliance, but by motion. And motion belonged to those who could sustain it. To the Americans who heard his words, it was sobering. They had fought men who, even in defeat, were disciplined and skilled, but they also recognized that they had been fighting an idea, the idea that sheer will could bend reality. The Battle of the Bulge proved otherwise. Reality was made of logistics, fuel, and factories. When U.S. forces finally reclaimed the burned depot at Stavelot, they found only scorched barrels and blackened snow. Engineers estimated that nearly 50,000 gallons had been destroyed or lost. But to the Americans, it didn't matter. Within a day, new convoys brought twice that amount to the front. That was the difference. For one side, 50,000 gallons was survival. For the other, it was a statistic. The war in Europe would last only a few more months. But the Battle of the Bulge had already answered the question of who would win. The answer wasn't written in strategy, but in the relentless hum of engines that never stopped. The German colonel's barrels of fuel became a metaphor for an empire that had burned itself out. Powerful, ambitious, but unsustainable. And as his men marched into captivity, the last light of the Reich flickered out in the reflection of burning oil. In the weeks after the Ardennes offensive collapsed, the Western Front changed character. The roar of engines that had once filled the forest fell silent. The roads that had echoed with treads and gunfire now carried only prisoners and wreckage. For the Allies, it was a time of regrouping. For the Germans, it was a time of reckoning. The official reports from the front read like obituaries for the Wehrmacht's mobility. The once proud panzer divisions, the cutting edge of German military power, were shadows of themselves. In less than 6 weeks, they had lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, 1,600 artillery pieces, and thousands of trucks that could never be replaced. Factories in the Reich were bombed to rubble. Fuel reserves, already almost gone, were annihilated. The Luftwaffe, which had been virtually absent during the offensive, ceased to exist as a fighting force. For the Allies, the scale of German losses confirmed what their intelligence officers had already known. The Third Reich had fired its last shot. It had gambled everything, its remaining oil, manpower, and morale, on one final offensive and lost it all in the snow. Captured documents later revealed the desperation behind the decision. Hitler had been warned repeatedly that the offensive was impossible without guaranteed access to fuel. His generals, Rundstedt, Model, and even the fanatical Sepp Dietrich, had argued for a limited strike or a defensive stand. But Hitler refused. He saw the capture of American fuel depots as the key to victory. In his mind, the barrels waiting in Allied dumps were an untapped arsenal that could turn defeat into triumph. That delusion carried an empire into ruin. When those barrels burned in Stavelot, so did the last remnants of German strategy. The consequences went far beyond the battlefield. Every liter of fuel consumed in the Ardennes was one not available for the Eastern Front. By January 1945, as the Red Army crossed the Vistula and advanced toward Berlin, German tank units on the Eastern Front were immobilized. Whole divisions fought without armor, reduced to static defense lines. The Reich's generals blamed the Western offensive for the disaster, calling it a suicide mission that bled us dry. Inside Germany, the mood changed. For the first time, even loyal citizens began to understand that the war could no longer be won. Trains stopped running regularly. Factories stood idle for lack of coal and oil. Cities were plunged into darkness as power grids failed. Every symbol of progress, the airplane, the tank, the motorized division, now stood as a reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, in the Allied camps, soldiers who had fought through the snow tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. They had faced an enemy who fought hard, who struck fast, and who refused to surrender until the last bullet. But when they reached the captured German vehicles, they realized the enemy hadn't been beaten by courage or numbers. He had been beaten by silence, the silence of engines that no longer ran. One American war correspondent described the scene at l'Église. The tanks were beautiful, even in ruin, but they were empty, as if the war itself had run out of breath. That emptiness echoed across Europe in the final months of the war. The Allies advanced faster than ever before, not because resistance had vanished, but because Germany could no longer move to resist. Its armies retreated on foot, its trains halted, its trucks abandoned. The speed that had once defined blitzkrieg now belonged to the other side. For the colonel who had once guarded the captured American fuel, captivity brought reflection more than humiliation. According to interrogation notes preserved in U.S. archives, he admitted that even if his men had used every drop of that fuel, it would not have changed the outcome. He said quietly, "We could have reached the Meuse, we could have burned more towns. But it would only have delayed the end, not prevented it." It was a sober truth that many of his fellow officers would repeat in post-war interviews. The Battle of the Bulge had not been Germany's last chance at victory. It had been its final act of denial. After the guns fell silent, the Battle of the Bulge entered history not as a triumph of strategy, but as a monument to futility. The forest that had once echoed with the thunder of artillery became quiet again, its silence broken only by the wind and the sound of Allied recovery teams clearing wreckage from the roads. The war would continue for only a few more months, but the meaning of that winter was already written. The Ardennes had exposed the truth about the Third Reich's final phase, that it was running on empty, driven more by faith than by fuel. In the years that followed, historians and soldiers alike would look back on the captured fuel episode at Stavelot as a symbol of the wider war. For many Germans, it represented the final realization that technological brilliance and bravery, could not overcome industrial imbalance. They had built the finest tanks, the most advanced aircraft, the most disciplined army, and yet none of it could function without the resources that their enemies commanded in abundance. One German veteran later said, "When we saw American fuel drums, we saw the war in miniature. We had the machines. They had the means to move them." It was a statement less about defeat than about the dawn of a new kind of warfare, where logistics, not leadership, defined power. For the Americans, the same event carried a different meaning. The Ardennes had been the bloodiest battle fought by the United States in Europe, costing more than 80,000 casualties, but it also proved something that few had understood before. The true weapon of democracy was not the tank or the plane. It was production. Factories, refineries, and convoys had done what no general alone could achieve. They had made it impossible for America to run out of war. The Red Ball Express, which had fueled the Allied advance months earlier, became the invisible hero of the campaign once again. Even as the German offensive raged, American supply lines kept flowing. When the fog cleared and the roads reopened, replacements arrived faster than the enemy could react. Fuel that had taken the Germans weeks to steal, the Americans replaced in hours. This difference was not lost on the men who fought. In letters home, U.S. soldiers often described the contrast they saw firsthand. They wrote of German tanks abandoned for lack of gasoline, of convoys halted mid-road, of enemy troops using bicycles and horses in a war fought with engines. To many of them, it was the clearest proof that the war's end was near. In the aftermath of victory, Allied analysts studied the German war effort in microscopic detail. They discovered that by 1944, Germany's total fuel output had dropped by more than 90% compared to its 1941 peak. Synthetic fuel plants, once capable of producing over 6 million tons annually, were now reduced to a fraction of that. The entire Battle of the Bulge had consumed fuel that the Reich could never replace. It was, as one U.S. logistics officer put it, the last breath of an army dying on its feet. For the surviving German officers, reflection came slowly. In Allied prison camps, many tried to rationalize the decision to launch such a doomed operation. Some blamed Hitler's delusion. Others admitted that by 1944, the army was too entangled in its own propaganda to see reality. But a few, like the colonel from Stavelot, spoke plainly. He told an American interrogator, "You won because your soldiers never waited for fuel. Ours always did." That quiet sentence would be quoted for decades by military historians as the perfect summary of industrial warfare. The colonel himself faded into obscurity after the war, repatriated, questioned briefly, and then forgotten. But his observation lived on. In the post-war years, the U.S. Army made the lessons of the Ardennes part of its doctrine. Training manuals emphasized logistics as the science of victory. Future conflicts went from Korea to Vietnam and would be fought with the same understanding that had defined that winter in 1944, that no amount of bravery or strategy could replace the flow of fuel. Even today, when historians walk the forests of the Ardennes, they still find the rusted remains of barrels and tank tracks beneath the soil. Each piece of metal tells the same story, not of glory or heroism, but of exhaustion, calculation, and the simple truth that empires die when their engines stop. The captured fuel depot at Stavelot was long forgotten by name, but not by meaning. It stands as a symbol of the moment when the German army, once the master of motion, stood still. And in that stillness, history turned its final page on the Reich. In the end, the story of the captured fuel was not about gasoline or steel. It was about motion, the invisible current that decides the fate of nations. In the frozen forests of Belgium, an army that once conquered Europe learned that courage cannot move a tank, and belief cannot start an engine. The men who guarded those barrels didn't just see the loss of fuel. They saw the loss of the war's rhythm, the heartbeat of a machine that had finally stopped. For all its brilliance, Germany's war effort had always been built on limits, on borrowed oil, on captured resources, on illusions of endless reach. The United States, by contrast, had turned distance and industry into weapons. Its power was not in the battlefield alone, but in the thousands of unseen hands that kept its soldiers moving, factory workers, truck drivers, engineers, and refinery crews who never saw the front but defined its outcome. That was the real difference between the two empires. One fought for power it could no longer sustain. The other built power it could never exhaust. The colonel's captured barrels became a quiet monument to that truth. 50,000 gallons of stolen American fuel, useless to those who needed it most, stood as the perfect metaphor for the end of Germany's war. When the flames rose over the Ardennes that December, they illuminated not a victory or a defeat but a revelation that in modern war, survival belongs to those who can keep moving when everything else stops. Years later, when veterans from both sides revisited the battlefields, many said the same thing. They remembered the cold, the silence, and the emptiness that followed. But above all, they remembered the stillness, the moment when the world's most mechanized army ran out of motion, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. Because in that silence, one truth echoed louder than all the guns that came before it. In war, power isn't just measured by strength, it's measured by how long you can keep going.